It was New Year's Eve, the night that promised a fresh start for many and a chance to celebrate the year's memories. But for Emma, this night would never be the same. What should have been a time for joy and laughter turned into an unforgettable nightmare that would haunt her forever. Emma was a quiet soul who preferred solitude over parties. The past few New Year's Eves had been spent curled up with a book or in front of the TV, but this time she decided to host a small gathering. Her apartment, perched on the top floor of a high-rise building, offered a perfect view of the city skyline. The decorations were subtle: string lights, a cozy fire in the corner, and a small table set up with snacks and drinks. At around 8 p.m., her friends started arriving. Sarah, Lily, Mark, and Jack were all there, chatting excitedly about the new year ahead. Emma smiled and made small talk, trying to fit into the social rhythm she wasn't so used to. Everything was going smoothly, or so it seemed. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah, her closest friend, had been acting strangely. She was quiet, almost too quiet, and whenever Emma caught her eye, Sarah would quickly look away. Emma thought nothing of it, blaming it on the excitement of the night. But then around 11 p.m., Sarah excused herself to go to the bathroom and never returned. "Sarah," Emma called out after a few minutes. No response. Confused, Emma walked down the hallway toward the bathroom. The apartment was eerily silent. She knocked gently. "Sarah, everything okay?" No answer. Emma's heartbeat began to race. She tried the door. It was locked. "Sarah," she called, now more anxious. There was no sound from inside. Emma stepped back and felt the cold grip of unease curl around her. She could hear faint laughter and music from the living room, but none of her friends seemed to notice Sarah's absence. She rushed back to the living room, scanning the faces of her friends, but Sarah was nowhere in sight. "Has anyone seen Sarah?" she asked, her voice trembling. They all shook their heads. "I haven't seen her since she went to the bathroom," Lily said, a puzzled expression on her face. Mark added, "She was right behind me when we came in, and now she's gone? That's weird." Emma's mind raced. Something wasn't right. It wasn't like Sarah to just vanish. She turned to the door, instinctively checking it for any signs of forced entry. The door was locked, and the security chain was in place. The windows were shut tight. There was no way Sarah could have left without anyone noticing. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Emma tried to push the worry aside. It was a strange occurrence, but maybe Sarah just needed some space. Still, the feeling that something was off lingered in the air. The party continued, but the fun was gone for Emma. Then, as the countdown began, a loud knock echoed from the door. Emma froze. Her friends paused their chatter, staring at her in confusion. The knock came again, louder this time. "I'll get it," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands shook as she approached the door, heart pounding in her chest. She peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Confused, she opened the door, stepping into the cold, empty hallway. She looked left and right but saw nothing. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant sounds of fireworks and the hum of the city below. Suddenly, she noticed it, the faintest trail of muddy footprints leading away from her door. The prints were wet, as if someone had walked through a puddle, and they led down the hallway. The faint odor of wet soil filled the air. Emma followed the footprints, each step making her stomach tighten with dread. She reached the stairwell door, which was ajar, and the trail of muddy prints led right inside. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the apartment. Her friends were still gathered around the table, oblivious to what was unfolding. It was like she was in a different world, one that felt wrong, disconnected from everything familiar. She opened the stairwell door, stepping into the cold, dimly lit space. The sound of her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. The muddy trail was still visible, leading down the steps. With every step she took, the feeling of dread grew stronger. As she descended the stairs, she could hear something faint, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A voice, not loud enough to make out words, but unmistakably there. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the bottom of the stairwell. The sound stopped. She stepped forward, her heart racing, and then she saw it. In the corner of the hallway, near the elevator, was a single figure standing motionless. Emma froze, her blood running cold. She could just make out the silhouette of a person, their features obscured by the shadows. But she knew it was Sarah. Sarah, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting the hallway in an unsettling strobing effect. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as she took a step closer. The figure shifted. It wasn't Sarah. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned toward her. The face was pale, almost deathly so, and the eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto hers. "Emma," the figure whispered, its voice low and raspy. "It's too late." Emma took a step back, her legs shaking. Her mind raced. Who was this? What did they want? She reached for her phone, but it buzzed in her hand before she could unlock it. A message appeared on the screen from an unknown number. "You were never meant to be alone tonight." Emma's heart dropped. The figure in front of her slowly moved closer, its hands outstretched. The air around her felt thick, heavy. She couldn't breathe. Just as she was about to scream, the lights went out. The hallway plunged into darkness, and the figure vanished. Emma stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence was deafening. Slowly, the lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. In its place was a single note, lying on the floor where it had stood. "I'm watching you from the shadows." Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her body shaking with fear. The words burned into her mind. Frantically, Emma turned to leave, but as she reached the stairwell door, it slammed shut in her face. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she pounded on the door, desperate to escape. But there was no response. The apartment above her, the one where her friends were still waiting, felt like a world away. Emma had no idea what was happening, but the sense of being trapped, of being watched, was overwhelming. She could feel the presence behind her, just out of sight. The door behind her creaked open, and a whisper echoed in the darkness. "Happy New Year, Emma?" Emma turned, but no one was there. The apartment was found empty the next morning. All her belongings were gone. The only trace of Emma was the glass of wine, now spilled on the floor, and the note, which remained as the only clue. "You were never meant to be alone tonight." Emma's heart raced, her chest tightening as she stood motionless in the hallway. The note in her hand trembled, its cryptic words haunting her. You were never meant to be alone tonight. But it was more than that. It was the sense of being watched, of something waiting for her. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and yet she knew it was still there. The presence, the figure, the mystery. As she turned to flee, the darkness around her seemed to swirl, pushing her back toward the stairwell. The door that had once slammed shut now creaked open, just wide enough for her to see, something moving in the shadows beyond. "Emma," a voice hissed, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It sounded like Sarah's voice, but distorted, like something was wrong with it. "Help me," the voice groaned. "You shouldn't have come." Her knees buckled beneath her, her thoughts fragmented in sheer terror. She ran, but it was as if the hallway stretched longer with each desperate step. Her phone buzzed again, but she couldn't bring herself to look. Another message appeared. "I told you. You can't run from me. I'm always watching." She froze. The shadows, the figures, the whispers. They weren't just in the apartment. They were part of her. The reality had twisted, and Emma understood too late. The presence that followed her wasn't just a person. It was something darker, something ancient, and it had claimed her soul. The last thing Emma saw before the lights went out for good was the mirror in the hallway reflecting her own face. But it wasn't her anymore. The eyes staring back at her were hollow, empty, and filled with dread. She was no longer Emma. She had become part of the darkness, lost to a night that would never end. And the note? It wasn't just a message. It was a warning. One she could never escape. As Emma's terror escalated, she realized too late that she was no longer in control of her fate. The presence she felt wasn't just haunting her. It had already claimed her. The darkness, now part of her, consumed her completely, leaving only a cold, empty shell behind, forever trapped in the night she could never escape.